The war between humans and aliens had raged for years, but on the desolate planet of Zorin, the final battle was about to unfold. The alien forces, led by the merciless and highly advanced AI systems, had crushed the last remnants of human resistance. Their troops, cold and calculating, moved with precision, sweeping through cities and towns, leaving nothing but ashes in their wake. Princess Zyra, the alien royal, stood high above the battlefield in a fortified command center, gazing down with disdain at the humans below. Her people, the Torethians, had conquered countless worlds, each more technologically advanced than the last. To them, humanity was nothing more than an insignificant blip in the vastness of the galaxy. The princess, standing over 6 feet tall with radiant blue skin and glowing eyes, was the epitome of Torethian superiority. She was a weapon, trained to lead and destroy. In the midst of the chaos, Zyra's cold voice echoed through the communication channels, issuing orders to her forces as they advanced relentlessly. She watched with satisfaction as her soldiers obliterated the last pockets of resistance. Human soldiers, barely armed, fought desperately, but Zyra knew it was only a matter of time before they fell. To her, the idea of humans fighting back seemed laughable. They were weak, outmatched by superior technology, and destined for extinction. But something unexpected happened. As the battle raged on, one human soldier, Corporal James Donovan, appeared in the midst of the chaos. Zyra had heard rumors of this soldier, an underdog, a survivor who had single-handedly taken down several of her forces before. At first, she dismissed it as a fluke, but now, as she observed him through her visor, she was forced to confront the reality. James Donovan was no ordinary soldier. With remarkable speed and precision, James weaved through the battlefield, taking out alien drones, evading laser fire, and disabling one of her top-tier combat units. He moved like a shadow, blending with the environment, using nothing but his wits and limited resources to strike at the heart of the invasion force. To Zyra's shock, he even managed to take down an armored war machine that had been considered invincible. The more Zyra watched him, the more she felt a strange feeling, something unfamiliar to her, something she couldn't quite place. She had been raised to believe that humans were weak and incapable of facing her kind. They were inferior in every way, and she had always been taught that their defeat was inevitable. Yet this one soldier had defied everything she had been taught to believe. He was resourceful, relentless, and most importantly, resilient. Zyra had never encountered anyone like him, and it troubled her. Just as she prepared to give the final command to obliterate the last human forces, an unexpected turn of events occurred. Zyra's own army was hit by an unexpected orbital bombardment, a devastating attack from a hidden enemy. The blast shook the ground beneath her, and for a moment, the world seemed to spin out of control. Her advanced shields flickered as debris rained down from the sky, and the command center shook violently. Zyra was thrown to the ground, dazed and disoriented. She barely managed to crawl to a nearby control panel, attempting to regain control of her forces, but the damage was too great. The AI systems that had once ensured her victory were now failing, and her soldiers, caught in the blast, were in disarray. Amid the confusion, Zyra's vision blurred, and she realized with a jolt that her forces were retreating. In the distance, she could see her flagship lifting off, pulling away from the chaos as the battle turned in favor of the humans. The princess, disoriented and wounded, was left behind. Her personal shield had failed, leaving her vulnerable to the harsh environment of the planet. She stumbled into the wilderness, unable to call for help, with no backup and no way to survive on her own. The cold, unforgiving landscape stretched out before her, and the princess, once so powerful and feared, was now alone. Her pride, once unshakable, had crumbled in an instant. Zyra had always thought of herself as untouchable, an untouchable warrior princess destined to lead her people to victory. Now, as the sun set over the desolate landscape, she realized the truth. She was nothing more than a lost, abandoned soul on a dying world. But as she staggered through the harsh terrain, she felt something stirring. The Xanter girl didn't respond right away. She tried to lift herself up, wincing as pain shot through her body. Adrian quickly reached out, stopping her. "Easy," he said softly. "You're still hurt." She glared at him, her sharp features hardening with a mixture of defiance and fear. Despite her injuries, she seemed ready to fight. Adrian could see it in her eyes, the warrior spirit that had made her so dangerous in the first place. But something was different now. She wasn't just a mindless soldier under the control of the Xanter regime. She was someone who had been abandoned, left to die alone in the wreckage of her people's war. Adrian carefully examined the wounds on her side, taking note of how deep they were. Her blood had started to clot, but there was still a chance of infection. He needed to clean the wounds and dress them properly, but he wasn't sure how much time they had. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the city, reminding him that the battle was still raging, and the Xanter weren't the only threat. Without warning, the door to the room suddenly slammed open. Adrian's heart skipped a beat, and he instantly reached for his weapon. But the figure in the doorway wasn't a Xanter drone. It was a human soldier, one of Adrian's squad mates, Sergeant Bonner. "Adrian," Bonner hissed, his eyes wide with disbelief as he looked at the Xanter girl lying on the floor. "What the hell are you doing? She's one of them. You can't trust her." Adrian's mind raced. He couldn't explain why he had helped her, why he had saved her life. It didn't make sense to anyone, but there was something inside him, something that told him that saving her was the right thing to do. The truth was, Adrian didn't trust her completely either, but he had no choice now. She was part of his responsibility. "I couldn't just leave her," Adrian said quietly, meeting Bonner's gaze. "She's human now. She's not the enemy." Bonner shook his head in disbelief, but didn't argue further. He could see the determination in Adrian's eyes. "All right, we need to move. Xanter drones are everywhere, and they won't stop until they find her. We need to get out of here." Adrian nodded, grateful for Bonner's help. As the two men quickly made plans to get the Xanter girl to safety, Adrian glanced at her one more time. She was still watching him, her eyes full of mistrust. But as she looked at him, Adrian saw something else, something that hinted at a bond, however fragile, that had formed between them. The fight for survival was far from Adrian moved swiftly through the shattered streets, the weight of the Xanter warrior in his arms, making each step feel heavier. Her body was limp, but her breathing had slowed into a steady rhythm, a sign that the painkiller was doing its job. Still, he couldn't relax. The city was crawling with Xanter patrols, and the drones, heavily armed and capable of cloaking themselves in the blink of an eye, could be anywhere. He had to find shelter fast, somewhere to keep her safe and tend to her injuries properly. His mind raced with thoughts of how this situation had turned into a nightmare, a human soldier rescuing an enemy combatant. If anyone from his squad found out, they'd never understand. The Xanter were ruthless. They had devastated entire colonies, wiping out civilians without a second thought. Yet here he was, saving one of them. The ground shook slightly as another distant explosion rattled the air. He gritted his teeth, pushing forward. The adrenaline from the battlefield was still coursing through his veins, sharpening his senses and fueling his resolve. But despite the urgency, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling of unease gnawing at him. What if he had made a mistake? What if the Xanter girl wasn't as helpless as she appeared? What if she was just playing dead, waiting for the right moment to strike? Adrian's thoughts were interrupted by a soft groan from the girl in his arms. Her emerald-colored skin had a strange glow to it, even in the dim light, and her black hair was matted with dirt and blood. As he adjusted his grip, she stirred slightly, and for a moment, Adrian thought she might wake up. But she stayed still, her breathing shallow but steady. He needed to find cover, and fast. Turning a corner, Adrian spotted a ruined building ahead, a tall structure that had once been a hospital. It seemed like the perfect place to hide, at least for a little while. He quickened his pace, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. The coast was clear for now, but he knew that could change in an instant. The uneasy peace that James and Princess Zyra had built between them was shattered one morning, when the distant sound of explosions echoed through the valley. The ground shook slightly, as if a deep rumble of thunder was approaching. It was the unmistakable sign of the Sorathian army returning in full force. Zyra tensed, her eyes narrowing as she stood up from where they had been resting. James quickly followed, pulling his blaster from its holster. The familiar weight of the weapon calmed him, but his heart was racing. The enemy wasn't far. They were close, closer than they had anticipated. The alliance between him and Sarah had been fragile from the beginning, but now it was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. "Are you sure it's them?" James asked, his voice low but urgent. Zyra, who had been a part of the Sorathian military for most of her life, didn't need to see the army to know who it was. She could hear the sounds of the warships in the sky, the rumble of armored soldiers moving through the terrain, and the unmistakable hum of cloaked vehicles as they moved in the shadows. "Yes," she said, her voice tight. "They've returned. I've been a part of this army my whole life. The sounds, the tactics, it's them." James's thoughts raced. They had been hoping for more time, more preparation before facing her people again. But now it seemed their time had run out. If they were to survive this, they would have to face her past, her history with the Sorathians, and the deadly forces that now hunted them both. "Can we fight them?" James asked, looking around for any form of cover or defense. Zyra's gaze turned to the horizon. There was little time left to strategize, but she knew that standing and fighting would be a futile effort. They needed to move fast, or they would be overwhelmed before they even had a chance to act. The Sorathian army had always been powerful, and this was not the kind of force they could face head-on. Their only option was to outsmart them, to use the same guerrilla tactics. Bonner's face was as grim as ever, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Determination, perhaps, or maybe it was a quiet acceptance of their fate. Whatever it was, it made Adrian's resolve harden. They were in this together now. There was no turning back. "We fight," Bonner said quietly. "We fight until we can't fight anymore." And with that, they made their final move into the heart of darkness. The time for running was over. Adrian's pulse raced as he stared down the line of Xantar soldiers blocking their path. His heart hammered in his chest, and every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to find a way out. But there was no way back now. The Xantar had them trapped, and the supply depot, their last hope of survival, lay just beyond the line of heavily armed soldiers. Bonner was already crouched behind a nearby wrecked vehicle, taking aim with his rifle. His hands were steady, his eyes cold with focus. The others had already moved into position, waiting for the signal to engage. The air was thick with tension as they waited, the distant sound of Xantar drones buzzing overhead like vultures. Time seemed to stretch as they prepared for what would undoubtedly be the fiercest fight of their lives. "We hold them here," Bonner said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "We don't let them move forward. We fight with everything we've got." Adrian nodded, gripping his rifle tightly, his fingers itching to pull the trigger. His mind raced with calculations and plans. He had trained for moments like this, but nothing could truly prepare him for the feeling of standing face to face with overwhelming odds. The Xantar soldiers outnumbered them at least 5-1, and their firepower was far superior. Yet, in the back of his mind, something told him they had a chance. They were humans. They had the will to fight, the instinct to survive. "We can do this," Adrian muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. The silence between them was broken by a loud, authoritative voice from the Xantar side. A tall Xantar officer, standing at the front of the line, raised a hand, signaling his troops to hold. He was their leader, the one who would decide whether they fought or simply surrendered. He was staring directly at Adrian, his cold, calculating eyes studying them with an intensity that made Adrian feel like prey under the gaze of a predator. "You have nowhere to run, human," the officer called out, his voice deep and menacing. "Surrender now, and your death will be quick. Resist, and you will all die here, slowly." Adrian's grip on his weapon tightened. The officer's words were nothing new to him. He had heard similar threats before, but they had never carried this much weight. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making a stand, showing the Xanter that humans weren't just going to roll over and die without a fight. Bonner's voice broke through the tension. "Don't listen to him. We've got one chance to make it out of here, and we're taking it." Without another word, Bonner rose from behind the wreckage and opened fire. The sound of gunfire echoed through the narrow streets as their weapons discharged, the shots cutting through the air with a sharp, violent crack. The Xanter soldiers immediately returned fire, their energy weapons glowing with deadly precision. The battle had begun. Adrian dove behind cover, narrowly avoiding a blast that scorched the ground where he had been standing moments before. The heat of the explosion seared through the air, and the sharp smell of burnt ozone filled his nostrils. His mind raced, calculating the best route for their next move. There were too many of them, too many soldiers, and they couldn't afford to waste their ammunition. He peeked out from behind cover, eyes scanning the Xanter soldiers' positions. There were gaps in their formation, weaknesses they hadn't accounted for. He saw it. The officer was exposed, standing too far from his men. It was a risky move, but it was their only shot. Adrian signaled to Bonner. "Take the officer," Adrian ordered, his voice a growl of determination. "We take him out, and they'll lose their coordination." Bonner gave a curt nod. In one fluid motion, he stood and fired a single shot. It hit the officer directly in the chest, and the tall figure collapsed to the ground with a grunt, his weapon skidding across the pavement. The Xanter soldiers froze for a split second, their leader now fallen. The brief pause was enough. They stepped out into the open air, and immediately the oppressive atmosphere of battle seemed to swallow them whole. The warships were hovering above, their sleek black forms cutting through the sky like predators waiting to strike. The Xorethian army marched forward in tight formation, their battle armor gleaming in the sunlight. But Xayra didn't flinch. She led James forward, staying low to avoid detection. Together, they moved through the thick trees and underbrush, using the environment to hide their presence. Their goal was clear: get to the heart of the enemy's forces and strike hard. As they moved closer to the Xorethian soldiers, they heard a familiar voice over the radio. It was the general, the same one who had led the Xorethian forces before. "Find them. Destroy them. Leave nothing standing." The command sent a chill down James's spine, but Xayra's face hardened even more. Her people had betrayed her, and now they would pay the price. She wasn't going to let them win, not after everything she had sacrificed. They reached a vantage point, hidden behind a cluster of rocks. Xayra raised her hand, signaling for James to stop. They had to make their move carefully. The Xorethians were spread out, but they were ready for a fight. Xayra scanned the area, her eyes darting over the enemy lines. She knew this terrain better than anyone, and she had a plan. James checked his blaster once again, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the tension building. This wasn't just any battle, it was the final battle. The battle that would determine the fate of this planet. He had to keep his focus, stay calm, and trust Xayra. Xayra whispered into his ear, her voice steady and firm. "On my mark, we move. We hit their command center first. If we can disable their warships, we stand a chance." James nodded. "Let's do it." The two of them moved quickly and silently through the dense trees, their footsteps barely making a sound. As they approached the enemy's command center, James's nerves were on edge. They were close, too close, but there was no turning back now. Then suddenly, a loud explosion rocked the ground beneath them. One of the warships had opened fire, sending a shockwave through the air. Zyra's eyes narrowed. They were under attack, and the battle had officially begun. James didn't hesitate. He sprinted forward, his blaster raised, and fired at the nearest Corinthian soldier. The blast hit its target, sending the soldier to the ground. Zyra was right behind him, using her advanced combat skills to take down another enemy. The battle was fierce. The Exorithians fought with the same ruthless precision they had always shown, but Sarah and James were relentless. They moved like a well-oiled machine, coordinating their attacks and taking down the enemy one by one. James could feel the weight of every decision, every movement, but he never faltered. Soon, they reached the heart of the enemy's forces, the command center. But as they prepared to strike, a dark figure appeared before them. It was the general, the one who had led the Corinthian army into battle. His eyes locked onto Zyra, filled with contempt. "You betrayed your own people," the general hissed. "You are a traitor, and you will die like one." Zyra stood tall, her expression cold. "I'm no traitor. I'm fighting for something more than your empire. I'm fighting for freedom." The general sneered, drawing his weapon. "Then you will die for nothing." The final showdown had begun. The fate of two worlds rested on the outcome. The tension in the air was thick as James and Zyra stood ready for the inevitable battle. The once peaceful world they were trying to save now felt like the edge of an abyss, with the Corinthian army approaching fast. The hum of their war machines and the sound of their soldiers' boots marching forward created an oppressive atmosphere. Every step, every moment, brought them closer to a fight they couldn't escape. Zyra's thoughts raced, her heart heavy. She had lived through so many betrayals. But this was different. She had never imagined that her own people, the ones she had once ruled, would turn against her. The Exorithians saw her as weak, a failure because of her inability to bear children. They saw her as someone not worthy of the throne, and that label had driven her to this point. But now, standing beside James, she realized that she had become stronger than ever. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future of her people, for her planet, and for those she loved. Adrian and the others surged forward, taking advantage of the disarray. They moved like a well-oiled machine, darting between cover, firing at anything that moved. The Xantar soldiers attempted to regroup, but the damage had already been done. Without their commanding officer, they were losing their cohesion. Panic set in among the ranks. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as he darted from one piece of debris to the next. He could hear the sound of Bonner's rifle firing in rapid succession, the soldiers' movements as fluid and practiced as a dancer's. It was an intense, chaotic dance of violence, one where the difference between life and death came down to the smallest of decisions. In the heat of the battle, Adrian's focus shifted to the Xantar girl in his arms. Her condition had worsened. Her breath came in shallow, painful gasps. He knew she wouldn't survive much longer unless they could get to the depot. They had to make it. "We're almost there," Adrian shouted to his team. "Push forward." But just as he spoke, a surge of Xantar reinforcements arrived, pouring into the street from the nearby buildings. The tide of battle was shifting again, and the humans were now outnumbered. Adrian's stomach churned as he realized their chances of survival were slipping through their fingers. "Bonner, we need a new plan," Adrian called out, his voice rising with urgency. Bonner didn't hesitate. "Retreat to the depot. We'll make our final stand there." Adrian nodded, pulling the Xantar girl closer. They had no other choice. The depot was their last hope. They broke from cover and ran, gunfire ripping through the air around them. The sound of enemy weapons charging and discharging was deafening, but they kept moving, forcing themselves toward the narrow path that would take them to the supply depot. Every step felt like an eternity, each footfall a reminder that they were running out of time. They had fought hard, but now the final test awaited them. It was do or die. As they reached the depot's gates, Adrian turned back for one last look at the battlefield. Their fight wasn't over yet, but they had made it this far. Now, It was time for the final stand. And this time, they would fight with everything they had. The depot gates slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud, a sound that echoed through the narrow corridors, marking the temporary end to the brutal fight outside. Adrian's heart raced in his chest, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as the weight of their narrow escape began to sink in. The Xanter had almost overrun them. And yet, by sheer will and determination, they had made it to the safety of the depot, at least for the moment. But the fight was far from over. Inside the depot, the harsh, flickering lights cast long shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and blood, and the oppressive silence was deafening after the chaos they had just endured. Adrian could feel the weight of exhaustion bearing down on him. His muscles screamed in protest, his legs shaking as he leaned against a metal crate for support. The adrenaline from the battle was slowly wearing off, and the pain from the wounds he had sustained began to make itself known. But his focus remained sharp. "Get the supplies ready," Bonner barked, his voice hoarse but commanding. He moved quickly, checking their remaining ammunition and ensuring that the defensive systems of the depot were activated. There was no telling how long they could hold out. The Xanter might regroup and try again. And this time, they might not be so lucky. Adrian nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were with the Xanter girl he had carried through the battle. She had barely survived, her pulse weak, her breathing shallow. He gently placed her on a makeshift bed, his hands trembling as he wiped the sweat from his brow. Her condition was dire, but there was still hope. The medical supplies in the depot could save her, but only if he acted fast. "Stay with me," Adrian whispered softly, as if his words could somehow reach her. He checked her injuries again, doing his best to stabilize her. The battle had been long, and the wounds she had sustained were severe. The Xanter were brutal, leaving no mercy for anyone who got in their way. Bonner walked over to him, his face set in grim determination. "How is she?" he asked, his tone betraying the concern he felt for the alien girl.